To win without fighting is best. Sun Tzu, The Art of War. Xi Jinping, President for Life in China, met with his top military leaders in the throne room of the Forbidden City. Xi sat on the throne. His generals stood in a row before him. "What is the status of our preparations for the conquest of America?" he asked. General Yu stepped forward. "Mr. President, the preparations are going well. We have infiltrated every institution from government to business to education. Those people will act on our command. The American military is under strength, and they have used up most of their weapon stocks in the Ukraine war. They are not able to build new supplies because they have no factories. They will run out of diesel fuel in a few weeks, and everything will stop. We have been able to stage large stocks of weapons in their ports because they are too lazy to inspect our cargoes. If a box says iPhone on the label, they believe it." "Do you think we are ready to move forward?" she asked. "I do. Are there any other opinions?" General Tzu stepped forward. "Based on the teaching of my illustrious ancestor, I think it would be foolish to invade." "Why is that?" "It's more than 6,000 miles from our shores to the shores of America," Tzu said. "It will be difficult and costly to maintain supply lines. And even though we have a very large army for defending our land, we can only send a relatively small number to invade them." "But I thought General Yu said their military is weak." "It is, but it is not only the military we have to worry about." "Who else is there?" she asked. "The American people." "And why should we fear them?" "Because, in America, there are more guns than people," Tzu replied. "And some of those people are what they call preppers." "And what is a prepper?" "Someone who has guns, ammunition, and enough stored food to last for years. Many of them have served in the American army. Most Americans think they are crazy, but they feel like the situation justifies their point of view. If we invade, they will go to war with us." General Yang steps forward. "My president, General Tzu is a foolish old man who should be retired." General Yang gestured to indicate the other officers. "All of us are confident we will succeed." The attack. On the evening of the Chinese attack, Zach Reynolds, 38, an Air Force non-com, hugged his wife and kids before he went to work. 20 minutes later, he checked into the command post at Travis AFB and sat down at his console. He turned to one of the other people on second shift. "Anything happening out there?" "Nothing," the airman said. "Quiet as a tomb." 2 hours later, Zach heard bombs explode. The lights went out and the computer systems went down. The emergency lights came on. In the White House Situation Room, emergency lights glared from the corners of the room. "Does anyone know what is going on?" the president demanded. "Somebody took down the grid," his chief of staff replied. "What the heck is the military doing about it?" "They can't do much. Everything is down. We're screwed." "I want a better answer than that." "I'll see what I can do." "Get out of here. I need to think." After waiting to see if operations would resume, Zach and the other people went outside. The street lights were out, but the night sky was lit with the flames from burning airplanes. People walked toward the airfield, and were shocked by what they saw. Almost all of the planes on the base, C-17s, C-5s, and KC-10s were on fire. They tried their cell phones but there was no service. Some of them started to take video. The security forces drove around telling people to leave, so Zach got in his car and headed for home. He turned a corner near his house and saw flames ahead. He came to where his house should have been and saw nothing but a smoking crater. He got out of his car to take a closer look. There was no sign of his family. He slumped on the curb, crying. Later some people came by and led him away. The next morning he lay on a rug in someone's den, passed out. An empty whiskey bottle lay next to him. Later, Zach sat on the back porch with a cup of coffee, staring at nothing. "I'm going to kill the bastards." A few days later, People gathered for the funeral of Zach's family. Nothing had been found of them, so 3 empty urns stood before the congregation. Dust to dust, ashes to ashes, the chaplain said. We pray our Heavenly Father to take them into life everlasting. Amen. Occupation. Getting more food for the Chinese people was the original objective, so they imposed strict rationing on the people in the conquered territory. The Chinese set up a database to track every person who came to the food lines. Everyone needed a food ration card. They enforced lockdowns on anyone who was not essential to their mission. Many people lost their jobs and income because of that. Their landlords lost rent and the people stood in long lines for food. There were occasional protests, but the Chinese police were very skilled at dealing with them. There had been many protests back home because of the conditions in China. Over time, people got tired of the lockdown and started to violate it in small ways. The Chinese couldn't stop it, because they didn't have enough troops. But they got the message about the lack of love and respect. People also resorted to the black market and underground economy to survive. In the Chinese command center, Colonel Yin approached a soldier. "What are you hearing on the National Security Agency lines?" he asked. "A lot of frustration. We blinded a lot of their satellites, so they have to use people on the ground. They're not set up for that. It makes it hard for them to plan moves against us." "How are we doing with the gun nuts?" the colonel asked. The technician showed the National Rifle Association logo. "We hacked their membership list and geocoded all the members on the West Coast." The technician showed a website of a large gun dealer. "And we've hacked the dealer sites, so we know a lot about who has what and how active they are." "Good work. We've been able to cross-reference about 10% of them with the FBI. We know who the most dangerous people are. A lot of them are in militias. Round them up." When the Chinese started to round up the militias, many of them went underground. Colonel Yin checked in with an operator who was scanning high-altitude images of Los Angeles. "Any signs of resistance?" he asked. "No. The people are doing what they are told to do." "I'm surprised they aren't fighting us," Colonel Yin said. "They have all those guns and make a lot of noise about defending their homes, but it's just talk. Call me at the first signs of trouble." "I will, sir." Resistance. Zach sat around a kitchen table with some of his buddies. "We can't just sit here and do nothing," he said. "Yeah, but we're Air Force, not Army," someone replied. "And we don't have any airplanes left. So we need to learn to fight them on the ground," Zach said. "Know anyone who can help with that?" a third man asked. "No, but maybe we can find someone." "I'm a ham radio operator," a fourth person said. "I'll ask on my networks." A week later, Zach met with his group. There was a new face at the table. The ham operator introduced him as Lance, no last name. "Tell us about yourself," Zach asked. "I retired from the Special Forces as a colonel," Lance said. "I served tours all over the world in places I can't talk about. I dealt with insurgencies, and what I know can also be used to start an insurgency. I just want to kill the bastards who killed my family," Zach said. "We'll get to that," Lance said, "but we have to lay the groundwork first." "No offense," another man said, "but I have a wife and kids to think about. I'm not about to do a Rambo on this." "Don't worry," Lance said, "there are lots of ways to contribute. Such as providing food and shelter to the resistance. There is some risk to that, but not as much as going out on field operations." Lance paused. "We're going to be fighting what some people call the war of the flea. It's about dealing with an enemy that has superior power. It's about wearing them down until you can wipe them out." "So you've lived it," Zach said. "I was on the receiving end of it in Nam," Lance said. "We never saw those mothers. We'd be on patrol and out of nowhere someone would get hit. If we hid behind a tree, those AK rounds would punch right through. Lots of guys died that way. I've seen the same thing in other places. You lose all the time because you have to go looking for them, and they just have to wait for you. I've still got my deer rifle, one man said. Ever shoot a man? Lance asked. No. I know a lot of people want to get something going, Lance said. But first we need to know what we're dealing with. We need to know how many they are, where they are, what equipment they have, and how they move around. Lance turns to Zach. Do you know how to do that? He asked. No, but I can figure it out with some help, Zach said. I'll help you. Lance turned to the ham operator. You found me on the networks, so maybe you can find other people to help gather information. No problem, the ham said. From what I've heard, there are not a huge number of them on shore so far. No doubt they thought that surprise would be enough, Lance said. Let's hope they can't land a lot of people on ships or planes. Estimates. A few weeks later, Zach, Lance, and their group met again. After they settled in with their beverage of choice, coffee for some and beer for others, Lance began to go over the information that had been gathered. First, in terms of the big picture, I think they have violated their own rules for engaging in wars. What do you mean? Zach asked. Their big thinker on war was a man who lived almost 2,000 years ago, Lance replied, a man named Sun Tzu. I've heard of him, Zach said. Good. The first mistake they have made is in the area of what Sun Tzu referred to as estimates. Basically, he believed you should think before you strike. About what? Zach asked. You need to think about who your target is, where they are, how big they are, and their capabilities. You also need to think about likely weather conditions and distance. Zach took a pull on his beer. We know who the target is, he said. Us. Lance chuckled wryly. For sure. And who are we? We're the country with the biggest military budget in the entire world. It would be stupid to attack us, another man said. It would be, unless you could weaken us first. I think they've made some progress with that. The virus and fentanyl are two factors. They didn't cause it, but the war in the Ukraine also favors them. We have used up a lot of supplies by donating them to Ukraine. Our military is tired out after decades of war, and they are having recruiting problems. We left a lot of good stuff in Afghanistan with our stupid withdrawal. Plus, they have attacked our transport, communications, and cyber systems so hard that our military is having a hard time responding. Sounds like we're screwed, a fourth man commented. It's not a complete disaster when you consider the factor of distance, Lance said. The distance between San Francisco and Shanghai is more than 6,000 miles. They'll have to bring people, equipment, and supplies in planes or ships. Even without opposition, that's a big logistics challenge. Zach leaned forward. I've done logistics for much smaller operations, he said. It was not easy. No, it's not, Lance said. Keep in mind that the Chinese army is mainly built for defense of the homeland, not offense. That is because of what they suffered under the Japanese during World War II. If they have taken down our military, doesn't that mean they'll be able to bring in everything they need without being hassled? Zach asked. Our ham friends have been in contact with other hams on active duty. Their intelligence is that we have some assets that are still operational in the Pacific, so there will be some resistance from them. San Francisco and Los Angeles are the main ports on the West Coast, so those bottlenecks may provide opportunities for hurting them. Did the ham guys get any idea about how many of them there are? Zach asked. We don't have a precise number, but there is probably less than they need for a successful occupation. According to the studies that have been done on occupations, they would need 800,000 just for California, and about 6 million for the whole country. Their whole army is about 2.5 million, including reserves. I see why you say they screwed up, Zach commented. That doesn't mean it's going to be easy to defeat them. Ambush. A few weeks later, the men met again. How are we going to do this? Zach asked. We're going to start off slow, Lance answered. Small operations with little risk. Just to let them know we're going to fight them. Can you be more specific? One of the other men asked. As I mentioned before, they are spread thin. This means they are concentrating on controlling the major cities where most of the population is. We can start by making them nervous about going outside of those metro areas. How will we do that? Zach asked. We're in contact with people who are very good at shooting rifles at long ranges. We're getting them up to speed on being scout snipers. Soldiers have hated snipers for as long as we have had rifles. You never see the man who fires the bullet that kills you. You don't even hear the bullet coming. It's very demoralizing. A few days later, Lance and Zach lay on top of a small hill overlooking I-80. They had hiked to this location after parking their car under a tree and throwing a camouflage net over it. The car was typical silver Camry. The location offered an easy escape route. They were both wearing ghillie suits, which made them almost invisible in the terrain. Lance was armed with a heavy-barreled .300 Winchester Magnum he normally used for 1,000-yard range competition. The gun was equipped with a powerful scope instead of the normal peep sights. Lance had also added a suppressor to the end of the barrel. The gun was wrapped in ghillie material. Zach had the selective fire MP4 he normally carried, but his main job that day was being the spotter. He had a spotting scope mounted on a low tripod. It was also covered with ghillie material. It was the afternoon of a warm day, and they were sweltering inside their camouflage. Damn, it's hot, Zach exclaimed. Drink some more water, Lance said. It won't cool you down, but it will keep you from getting dehydrated. How long are we going to be here? Zach asked. As long as it takes, Lance replied. But really, it shouldn't be much longer. Our scouts are pretty sure they make this run at this time every day. You sure you can hit a moving vehicle at this range? It may take more than one shot, but a car is about the same size as a 1,000-yard target. The hard part is figuring out the math. What math? The combination of distance, wind, temperature, bullet spin, and elevation. Watch the scope now. It's almost time. Zach continued to scan the north-south side of the freeway. He noticed that Lance was working with something on his cell phone and making notes. From time to time he would look through his scope. What are you looking for? Zach asked. I'm trying to dope the wind between here and there so I can figure the lead. 20 minutes later Zach saw a Chinese Jeep coming down the road. Jeep, one man, Zach said. Sure, Lance asked. I see the flag on the door. It doesn't look like it has any armor. They don't know they need it, yet, Lance snickered. Lance started to track it with his rifle. When I fire, try to see where the bullet hits. It's dry, so you should see a puff of dust if I miss. Okay. Zach heard Lance take a deep breath and then let out most of the air. The crack of the rifle going off startled Zach for a moment, but he managed to get his view back quickly. He saw a puff of dust at the side of the road ahead of the Jeep. Maybe 10 yards ahead. Lance opened the bolt, caught the fired case, and slid in another round. He settled in and squeezed off another round. No dust. Guys looking around trying to see what happened. Through his scope, Zach saw the Chinese soldier stop the vehicle, get out, and walk around to see if a tire had blown. He paused as he came around to the driver's side to inspect something. He looked at the hills where Lance and Zach were. The Chinese soldier opened the door and started to get in. With his back facing them, Lance fired another shot. Zach could see a dark spot form on his back, and he collapsed. Let's get out of here, Lance said. But slowly. They backed off the top of the hill. Both of them scanned the land below them with their scopes, and saw no people. They hiked back to their car, stowed the gear, and drove away. They talked as they drove. What's the point of doing that? Zach asked. For one thing, it makes them nervous. They've had a free hand up until now, and now they know they're in a fight. For another, if they want to keep making these runs, they'll have to use heavier vehicles with guns, or more vehicles, maybe drones, and more men. We're not the only ones doing this, so it tends to spread them out and drain their resources. Do you feel bad about killing people like that? Zach asked. Sometimes it's the only option. The hacker. Willie, 33, a trust fund baby, and Melissa, 31, his girlfriend, lived in an old storefront in a residential neighborhood. Inside, the front was the living area, with a couple of threadbare couches and a large flat-screen TV on the wall. The middle area was the kitchen and dining area. Folding screens separated the kitchen from the sleeping area in the back. In the basement, Willie had a fully equipped hacker lab. He had linked 24 PCs together to make his own supercomputer. He had an electronics lab with a full set of instruments for detecting and analyzing signals. There was a bank of monitors on a large desk. He had a fast phone line and a couple of space-facing dishes on the roof. The roof was a garden paradise with rows of plants in containers and a canopy with 2 lounging chairs. Willie and Melissa lounged in the chairs and passed a joint back and forth. Want to? Willie asked. Sure. Melissa knelt beside him and unzipped his jeans. She sucked him until he got hard. She pulled up her peasant skirt, straddled him, and sank down on him. Feels so good, she said. Armories. We should have secured these on day one, Colonel Yang said. They were standing in the doorway of a National Guard armory in Vacaville. An empty armory. Most of it was old gear, Lieutenant Chen said. Yes. Old assault rifles. Old machine guns. Old mortars. A lot of ammunition. Old radios we can't hear. Nothing that can hurt us, Colonel Yang said sarcastically. Theory. Lance gathered the team for a training session. During the Vietnam War, a guy named Robert Tabor wrote a book called The War of the Flea, Lance said. He was a consultant who was asked to explain why the US seemed to be losing the war. I was there, an old man said. It was totally FUBAR. What does that mean? Zach asked. Messed up beyond all recognition, the old man replied. They all laughed. Lance waited for the laughter to die down. It was a study of insurgencies, he said. Guerrilla wars are nothing new, but our military was basically trying to win using tactics left over from World War II. Lance paused to pour himself another cup of coffee. He continued. We thought that massive amounts of air power and heavy equipment on the ground would be decisive, but it wasn't. Guys and gals in black pajamas were popping up everywhere, killing our people, and then disappearing. It was frustrating as hell, the old man said. We did bad things sometimes because it was so crazy. It didn't end with Vietnam, Lance said. In Afghanistan, our heavy army was defeated by guys on foot with small arms. How does that apply here? Zach asked. This time we're the flea, and they're the dog. Chuckles. I wish we could count on our army, Lance said, but they've been hit hard and have a lot of problems. So what are we going to do? The old man asked. You're probably aware that recently we conducted a lot of sniping attacks, Lance said. We'll continue to do that, but there are other ways to attack them. Such as? Zach said. Their operations depend on a lot of things. Transportation, power, communications, internet. We can go after those with a minimal risk of casualties. We'll have to kill some of them, and we'll lose people too. Just remember that their soldiers are here because they were forced to come. A lot of them are just kids. Demoralizing them is just as effective as killing them. I heard that they have a lot of drones, the old man commented. They do, and that may be a tough one. We're looking for people who can help with that. A test. How do you know this will work? Zach asked. We don't, Lance replied. That's why we're doing a test. Zach and Lance were hiding in a small patch of woods just north of the main runway of the Sacramento airport. They had been dropped off on West Alberta Road just after midnight. Zach had gone into the woods to hide. Lance had spent the remaining hours of darkness slowly crawling to the end of the runway where he left a package. The package was 2 pounds of high explosive wired to a small radio. When Lance came back to the woods, he found Zach's hide and settled in. "Where did you learn to make those?" Zach asked. "In Iraq. I wasn't making them, but I did work on disarming them. That taught me how to make them." "What if it doesn't work?" "We'll try something else." They settled down to wait. It would be a long day because the large Chinese drones typically stayed out until sunset. Lance reached into his pack and pulled out a tattered copy of The Art of War. He handed it to Zach. "Read this while we wait." "I already read it." "I've read it 100 times at least," Lance said. "Every time I go through it I see something I didn't see before. There are ideas in there that apply to what we're doing today." "Such as?" "Just read it." Zach settled back and started to read. The hours passed slowly. It was a typical summer day in Sacramento, so they were glad to have the shade. At about 8:30, Lance got a short message on his phone. "Drone coming," the scout reported. "Eyes north," Lance commanded. They turned and searched the sky for an approaching drone. 15 minutes later a small speck appeared in the sky. As they watched it approach, they could see that it was their intended target. Lance turned on a handheld transmitter and waited. When the drone reached the end of the runway, Lance pressed the transmit button. The bomb went off. The concussion sent the drone spinning out of control. It hit the runway hard, scattering debris for hundreds of feet. Dozens of Chinese came out of the airport buildings to see what the ruckus was. "Good work," Zach exclaimed. "Yeah. Let's get out of here." Lance sent a short message to the scout, who would pick them up. They worked their way down the strip of woods and crossed the field to Power Line Road where they saw their ride. They got in the car and drove north at a normal speed to avoid drawing attention. Finding Willie. Lance and Zach met about planning future operations. They were at Lance's house in Vacaville. Lance lived in the older part of town. Most of the houses were older and some would run down, with weeds instead of grass in the yards. He did this to make himself less visible, being a gray man, he said. Once you got into the house everything was spick and span and up to date. After he got to know Zach better, Lance had shown him the hidden room where he kept his weapons and other gear. Some of the weapons were things a civilian was not supposed to have. Lance had done all the work himself, so the only people who knew about it were people he trusted. "I'm hearing about a lot of drone activity," Lance said. "Have you had any luck finding someone who can help us with that?" "Actually, I have," Zach replied. "But he lives in Oakland. It might be risky to go there to see him." "It's a risk we have to take. The Chinese are spread thin so we can probably avoid their checkpoints. We have people watching them. We know where they are and when they change locations." A few days later, Lance and Zach got into Lance's Camry and drove south on State Route 113. They continued on state routes until they got to Livermore. Then they took another small road through the mountains until they got to San Antonio Valley. They turned west to San Jose. From there they worked their way up the peninsula. Using handheld ham radios, they were in continuous contact with watchers who kept them away from the checkpoints. They arrived at Willie's address, pulled around the back, and parked. They went to the door and knocked. A long-haired, bearded man wearing shorts and a Grateful Dead t-shirt came to the door. "Are you Willie?" Lance asked. "Yes. I'm Lance, this is Zach. Come on in. Coffee's on." Willie led the way to the kitchen area. He took down 3 cups and brought the pot to the table. The cups were all different designs of Noritake china. He filled all the cups, and then sat down at the end of the table. "I understand you're looking for some help with the drones. And maybe anything else you can handle," Lance said, "like communications and computers. If I can't, I may have friends who can. You may have heard that we took down one of their big drones." I did. Very low tech, but very effective. They all laughed. We'll continue to do that, Lance said, but they're on alert now, so it'll be harder. We need ways to interfere with them without exposing our people unnecessarily. I can probably help with that, Willie said. You probably know that years ago the Iranians took control of American drones and landed them intact in Iran. I did hear about that. It was a shock to the Pentagon. Why don't we go downstairs and I'll show you a few things. When they walked into Willie's lab, they were amazed at the array of equipment he had. This is some hobby you have here, Lance exclaimed. It's more than a hobby, Willie replied. It's an obsession, and sometimes I get paid to indulge it. By who? Zach asked. Alphabet agencies, Willie replied, and some groups that don't have initials. Such as? I can't say who, but some of them are interested in elections. Won't be any elections for a while, Lance commented. For sure, Willie replied. Let me show you some things. Willie sat down on his computer chair. He pointed to some chairs at other workstations. Pull up those chairs. Lance and Zach sat on either side of him. He brought up an image of a Chinese drone called the Wing Long. That looks a lot like our Predator drone, Lance noted. It's pretty close. They stole the plans from us. It's what they do best. In this case, Willie continued, that works to our advantage because they copied all the code and control systems as well. Just for laughs, I hacked into their systems and stole their plans, so I know what modifications they made. And you can figure out how to control them, Zach asked. Probably. Does the government know you did this? Lance asked. They paid me. They didn't want the military to do it, so they could pretend they didn't know about it. How long will it take? Lance asked. We need to have this as soon as possible. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you through our contacts. Okay. Willie led them back upstairs and out to the parking lot. Nice meeting you, he said. You, too. Safe journey. Disarmed. One day, while Zach was watching the news, he heard this announcement. By order of the Chinese command, the announcer said, all guns are to be turned in within 48 hours. After that, anyone caught with a gun will be executed. Turn in the ammunition as well, but the guns must be unloaded. Later that day, Lance called for an emergency meeting of the group. What are we going to do about this? One of the men asked. I've discussed this with other commanders, Lance replied. The consensus is that we should partly comply in the big cities like Sacramento, San Francisco, and Los Angeles. Those are the areas where they have the biggest presence. What do you mean by partly comply? Zach asked. Turn in most, hide a few. In particular, we expect them to be more satisfied if we turn in anything that looks like an assault weapon, ours, axe, etc. Damn, one of the men exclaimed, that's the last thing I want to turn in. We understand that, Lance replied, but turning those in will mislead them, and provide cover for the ones we keep. We're planning to take guns to places in the mountains where they aren't likely to go. You'll get them back when we're ready to use them. From my cold dead hands, one man intoned. I'm sure they can arrange that, Lance said. This isn't a time for misplaced bravery. One more thing. They may have data that will tell them what you have, so you should turn in anything you have bought over the internet. Later that night, an older man in San Francisco sealed a pre-1964 Winchester 70 in a large PVC pipe. He buried the gun in the garden. Back in the basement, he picked up his AR-15 rifle and studied it. It had all the accessories needed to make it a combat weapon: optical sights, flashlight mount, bipod, and suppressor. I'll miss you. He put the rifle in the case and packed his ammo into a box. The next day he drove to one of the designated pickup points and found parking. He took the gun and ammo out of the trunk and joined a long line of people. There were dozens of armed Chinese positioned along the line. When he arrived at the table, he handed over his gun. They took a picture of his driver's license. A few days later a Chinese jeep pulled up in front of his home. 2 soldiers got out and knocked on his door. He opened the door. "How can I help you?" "We came to make sure you've turned in all of your guns." "No problem. Come in." The soldiers came in and went through his whole house, finding nothing. In the garage, they noticed a bow and quiver full of arrows. The senior officer said, "We don't care about those. They aren't going to come at us like a bunch of Mongolian horsemen." They went back to the front door. "We appreciate your compliance. I don't want any trouble." The soldiers left. He sat down heavily in his armchair, and breathed a deep sigh. "Assholes. Urgency." 3 cars pulled up in front of a house in San Francisco. Several men got out of each car and went in. Moments later, the house disappeared in a ball of flames. "Have you heard anything from that hacker guy?" Lance asked. "No," Zach replied. "Why do you ask?" "There was an incident in San Francisco. A bunch of our people were taken out by a drone. We need to get some countermeasures in place. They may have been tracked using their phones. We think their Chinese phones have backdoors, and they are using artificial intelligence to identify potential troublemakers. I'll set up a meeting with him." A few days later they made the trip to Willie's house, using the same back roads and help from spotters. In Willie's lab, Lance and Zach sat on either side of Willie as he studied the drone design. One monitor showed a schematic of the control system and the other showed the computer code. Willie scrolled through the code until he found the drone commands. The command set included control surfaces, navigation, weapons, cameras, and engine. He skipped to engine. The subcommands were start, stop, throttle up, and throttle down. "Aha!" Willie exclaimed. "The off button. How do we push it?" Zach asked. "It's similar to any radio-controlled aircraft. We just need the frequency and the command. And we can kill it with the right signal," Lance said. "If we want to." "Why do you say if?" "We could take them over and use them. That's what Iran did to us." "How soon can you do it?" "Hard to say. I'm not a radio guy. I'll put the word out to the ham community. They can probably build something," Lance said. Planning a raid. One day Zach saw Lance looking at pictures of guns on his laptop. "Shopping?" he asked. "Sort of," Lance answered. "What have you got there?" "A list of Chinese weapons," Lance answered. "I'm surprised you can still get that." "I've had it for a while, just in case." "So what are you going to do with it?" Zach asked. "We are going shopping. Like on Amazon, just going to order a bunch of this and that." Lance changed to a different tab on the browser. It showed the location of the Okinawa Armory in Sacramento. "They secured this early on," Lance noted. "Our people have been watching them bring truckloads of boxes into it. We have good pictures of some of those boxes. It's the sort of gear we want to get our hands on." "Such as?" Lance switched tabs and started to scroll through the web page. "We need some military weapons in order to make real progress against them." Lance stopped at various items. "Here we have 2 guns for personal weapons. Here are some sniper rifles so we can reach out and touch them. These are heavier guns that would be good for cars, trucks, buildings, and big drones on the ground. And some light machine guns for when we need a lot of bullets flying. They'll probably have a bunch of these RPGs. They are good against light armored vehicles. Also, they blow up after they fly 1,000 meters, and we can use that feature to attack areas." "What about communications?" Zach asked. "This laptop would be a real prize," Lance said. "It covers their whole battle management system. If we can get these radios, we have Chinese speakers who can listen to them. Between the 2 of them, they cover the whole chain of command from divisions to platoons." "When do we go?" Zach asked. "Probably next week. We have a lot of guards people and reservists working with us. They know the facility, and they are trained in small unit operations. Copyright 2023, all rights reserved.